Saint Helena Island in the year 1821. A 51-year-old man walks slowly through the gardens of Longwood House, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze lost in the infinite horizon of the South Atlantic. His hair, once perfectly groomed and styled in the fashion that became known across Europe as the Caesar cut, is now sparse and graying, falling in thin wisps across his pale forehead. His body, which once commanded armies of 500,000 men across the battlefields of Europe, is now swollen and weakened by a mysterious disease that seems to be consuming him from within, day by day, hour by hour. This is Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who once governed almost all of Europe from his throne in Paris, now reduced to a prisoner on a remote island thousands of miles from his beloved homeland of Corsica and France. In just a few weeks, on May 5th to be precise, he will draw his final breath in the cramped confines of his makeshift bedroom at Longwood House. But the circumstances of his death remain one of history's most enduring mysteries, a puzzle that continues to intrigue historians, toxicologists, and conspiracy theorists to this day. Was it arsenic poisoning administered by British agents who feared his potential escape and return to power? Could it have been a tropical disease, perhaps hepatitis or stomach cancer, brought on by the harsh conditions and poor diet of his island prison? Or was it simply the broken heart of a man who had lost everything he held dear, his empire, his family, his dreams of glory, slowly dying from the inside out? To truly understand Napoleon's tragic end, we must return to the pivotal year of 1815, when his extraordinary life changed forever in the muddy fields of Belgium. After his crushing defeat at the Battle of Waterloo in June of that year, a battle that lasted only one day, but determined the fate of Europe for the next century, the French emperor was forced to abdicate his throne for the second time in just over a year. But unlike his first exile on the Mediterranean island of Elba, where he still maintained some semblance of dignity, a small court, and genuine hope of eventual return to power, this time the European powers were absolutely determined to ensure he would never again pose a threat to the delicate balance of continental politics. The destiny chosen for the fallen emperor was as remote and forbidding as human imagination could devise. Saint Helena, a volcanic speck of land in the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean, located over 200 miles from the nearest landmass, was selected as his final prison not by accident but through careful deliberation by the British government and their European allies. The island, measuring just 47 square miles and governed by the British East India Company, offered the perfect combination of isolation, security, and symbolic humiliation for the man who had once made kings and queens tremble at the mention of his name. Napoleon's journey to Saint Helena aboard HMS Northumberland in the autumn of 1815 was itself a study in the systematic destruction of imperial dignity. Gone were the days when he traveled in magnificent carriages, surrounded by the imperial guard, with advance parties preparing his arrival in captured capitals across Europe. Instead, he found himself confined to a British warship, technically a prisoner of war, but treated with the complex mixture of respect and suspicion reserved for dangerous but defeated enemies. During the 67-day voyage, Napoleon attempted to maintain his composure and imperial bearing, engaging in philosophical discussions with British officers and dictating his memoirs to his loyal secretary. But those who observed him noted the gradual erosion of his legendary confidence. The man who had once crossed the Alps and marched triumphantly into Vienna, Berlin, and Moscow was now reduced to staring at the endless ocean, contemplating a future that held nothing but confinement and slow decay. When the rocky shores of Saint Helena finally appeared on the horizon in October 1815, Napoleon reportedly remarked that it was not a pleasant place, a masterpiece of understatement from a man who had seen the palaces of Europe and the pyramids of Egypt. Longwood House, which would serve as Napoleon's residence and prison for the remaining 5.5 years of his life, was a deliberate insult wrapped in the pretense of hospitality. Originally built as a barn and later converted into the summer residence of the island's lieutenant governor, the house was damp, poorly ventilated, and entirely inadequate for a man who had once resided in the splendor of the Tuileries Palace and Fontainebleau. The British government, under intense pressure from European allies to ensure Napoleon's complete isolation, had appointed Sir Hudson Lowe as the island's governor with explicit instructions to treat the former emperor as a dangerous prisoner rather than a fallen monarch. Lowe, a career military officer with a reputation for rigid adherence to regulations, found himself in the impossible position of guarding the most famous man in the world, while navigating the complex diplomatic sensitivities surrounding Napoleon's status and treatment. Every aspect of Napoleon's daily life was regulated and monitored, from his correspondence, which was censored and often delayed for months, to his movements around the island, which were restricted to a small area around Longwood House unless he accepted a British escort, which his pride would never allow. The psychological warfare was as deliberate as it was effective, designed to break the spirit of a man who had once believed himself destined to rule the world, leaving him to pace the gardens of his island prison, contemplating the ruins of his empire and the approaching shadow of his own mortality. For the former emperor, Saint Helena represented the ultimate humiliation, a small volcanic island lost in the middle of the South Atlantic, more than 2,000 kilometers from the nearest coast. The choice was no accident, carefully calculated by the British government to ensure that Napoleon Bonaparte would never again threaten the peace of Europe. Saint Helena was considered one of the world's most secure natural prisons, surrounded by rocky cliffs that rose like fortress walls from the churning ocean below and treacherous waters that made any escape attempt virtually impossible. The island's isolation was so complete that ships might pass within a few kilometers without ever spotting its dark silhouette against the endless horizon. Napoleon arrived at Saint Helena on the 15th of October in the year 1815 aboard the British ship HMS Northumberland, after a journey that had taken him further from the centers of power than any European ruler had ever been exiled. His first sight of the island must have been devastating, a moment that crystallized the full reality of his fall from grace. Here was a piece of dark volcanic rock emerging from the gray ocean waters without welcoming beaches or harbors, only threatening cliffs that seemed to mock his former ambitions and sparse vegetation struggling to survive against the constant wind that would become the soundtrack to his remaining years. His new accommodations were established at Longwood House, a decaying property located on a windswept plateau in the most desolate part of the island, chosen specifically to maximize his psychological discomfort. The house, originally built as a summer residence for the lieutenant governor, was in terrible condition when Napoleon arrived, a deliberate insult to a man who had once resided in the palaces of Versailles and the Tuileries. The roofs leaked constantly during the frequent rains, turning the interior into a maze of buckets and damp cloths that had to be repositioned daily to catch the dripping water. The walls were moldy due to the constant humidity that pervaded everything, creating an atmosphere that felt more like a dungeon than a residence fit for any gentleman, let alone a former emperor. The relentless wind whistled through the poorly sealed window cracks with a mournful sound that seemed to echo Napoleon's own despair, carrying with it the salt spray from the distant ocean and the reminder that he was truly cut off from the world he had once dominated. The few rooms available to him were cramped and poorly furnished, a stark contrast to the grand apartments he had known in Paris, Milan, and Vienna. The British governor responsible for watching Napoleon was Sir Hudson Lowe, a career military man known for his rigid adherence to regulations and his complete lack of sympathy for his famous prisoner. Lowe had been carefully selected by the British government precisely because he possessed none of the diplomatic finesse or intellectual curiosity that might have made Napoleon's captivity more bearable. He was a man who saw his duty in the simplest possible terms, to keep Napoleon Bonaparte confined and humiliated until death claimed him, and he pursued this mission with the methodical precision of a professional soldier following orders. From the moment of his appointment, Lowe implemented a series of petty restrictions designed to strip away every vestige of Napoleon's former dignity and imperial status. The former emperor was forbidden from being addressed by his imperial title and was instead referred to simply as General Bonaparte, a deliberate insult that reminded him daily of his reduced circumstances. His correspondence was strictly censored, with Lowe personally reading every letter that arrived or departed from Longwood House, ensuring that Napoleon remained as isolated from European affairs as if he had been buried alive. Even his daily movements were severely restricted, with Napoleon forbidden from traveling more than a few kilometers from Longwood House unless he accepted a British escort which his pride would never allow. These restrictions were not merely practical security measures, but formed part of a calculated campaign of psychological warfare designed to break Napoleon's spirit through 1,000 small indignities. Lowe insisted on treating Napoleon as a common prisoner rather than a defeated head of state, refusing him the courtesies that international law typically accorded to captured royalty. The former emperor was required to account for his whereabouts at all times, subjected to regular inspections of his quarters, and denied access to books, newspapers, or correspondence that might have kept his brilliant mind engaged with the wider world. Even his meals became a source of humiliation, as Lowe restricted the quality and quantity of food delivered to Longwood House, ensuring that the man who had once dined at the finest tables in Europe was reduced to simple fare served on plain dishes. The psychological impact of these measures was exactly what the British government had intended, gradually transforming the dynamic leader who had reshaped the map of Europe into a brooding, increasingly isolated figure whose legendary energy began to turn inward upon itself. As the months stretched into years, Napoleon found himself obsessing over trivial domestic matters, arguing with his small retinue about the arrangement of furniture or the organization of his meager library, as if these minor details could somehow restore a sense of control to a life that had been stripped of all real power and purpose. The man who had once commanded armies of hundreds of thousands now found his world reduced to a handful of rooms and a few loyal companions, watching helplessly as his body began to betray him and his once invincible will slowly crumbled under the weight of endless, purposeless days. Hudson Lowe arrived on Saint Helena in April 1816 with a reputation that preceded him like a dark cloud. A career military officer known for his rigid adherence to protocol and suspicious nature, Lowe had been handpicked by the British government specifically for his inflexibility and paranoia. The Colonial Office had given him clear instructions regarding his most famous prisoner. Treat Napoleon Bonaparte with the basic courtesy due to a former head of state, but ensure he remained completely isolated from the outside world and unable to influence European politics from his rocky prison. What began as a straightforward administrative assignment would soon evolve into a bitter psychological warfare that would consume both men and ultimately contribute to Napoleon's physical and mental deterioration. From their very first meeting, Lowe established a pattern of deliberate humiliation that would define their toxic relationship. The former emperor of the French, who had once been addressed as Your Imperial Majesty by kings and princes across Europe, was now referred to simply as General Bonaparte. This calculated insult cut deeper than any sword thrust Napoleon had ever received on a battlefield. Every letter Napoleon attempted to send or receive was subjected to Lowe's meticulous censorship, with entire passages blacked out or letters confiscated entirely. His daily walks were restricted to a cramped 12-mile radius around Longwood House, patrolled by British sentries who shadowed his every step like hunting hounds. The man who had once traversed continents commanding armies of hundreds of thousands now found himself arguing with guards about whether he could venture a few hundred yards beyond an arbitrary boundary line. Napoleon's every movement was catalogued and reported to the governor in tedious detail. When he rose from bed, what he ate for breakfast, which books he read, what conversations he held with his companions, all of it became fodder for Lowe's obsessive surveillance reports back to London. The former emperor, accustomed to commanding empires and deciding the fate of nations with a word, now found himself reduced to petitioning for permission to receive visitors or to plant vegetables in the small garden behind Longwood House. The constant frustration and systematic humiliation began to manifest in both Napoleon's mental and physical deterioration with alarming speed. Unable to channel his legendary energy into meaningful pursuits, he developed an almost obsessive fixation on trivial domestic details that would have been beneath his notice during his days of power. He would spend entire afternoons meticulously reorganizing his modest library, arranging and rearranging the same volumes as if the perfect order might somehow restore meaning to his existence. Hours were devoted to dictating his memoirs to his faithful companions, but these sessions often devolved into bitter rants about Lowe's petty restrictions rather than reflections on his glorious campaigns. The psychological pressure of being constantly watched, constantly thwarted in even the smallest desires, began to eat away at Napoleon's famous self-control like acid on metal. His temper, once kept in check by the demands of statecraft and military command, now erupted over trivial matters: a delayed meal, a misplaced book, a guard standing too close to his window. His companions at Longwood watched with growing concern as their emperor's legendary composure cracked under the relentless strain of meaningless days and deliberate provocations. The man who had faced down coalitions of European powers now found himself defeated by boredom, isolation, and the grinding humiliation of bureaucratic pettiness. Sleep became elusive as Napoleon's mind raced through endless cycles of rage, regret, and frustrated planning for escapes that could never succeed. His famous appetite diminished as meals became another source of conflict with Lowe's administration, every dish potentially poisoned by suspicion and resentment. By 1817, the first unmistakable symptoms of the mysterious illness that would eventually claim Napoleon's life began to manifest with increasing frequency and severity. What started as occasional bouts of nausea and stomach discomfort gradually evolved into episodes of excruciating abdominal pain that left the former emperor doubled over and gasping for breath. The man who had endured the hardships of military campaigns across Europe, who had slept on frozen ground during the retreat from Moscow, now found himself bedridden by waves of agony that no amount of willpower could overcome. His famous energy, the driving force that had carried him from obscure Corsican artillery officer to master of Europe, began to ebb away like water draining from a cracked vessel. Simple tasks that he had once accomplished without thought, writing letters, taking walks, even sitting upright for extended periods, became monumental challenges that exhausted his diminishing reserves of strength. The robust constitution that had sustained him through decades of warfare and political intrigue seemed to be turning against him, as if his own body had joined the conspiracy to break his spirit. His skin took on a sallow, unhealthy pallor that contrasted starkly with the vibrant complexion he had maintained even during his most stressful campaigns. Weight began to fall away from his frame, transforming the stocky, powerful figure that had dominated European battlefields into a gaunt shadow of his former self. Napoleon's companions watched helplessly as their emperor's physical decline accelerated, each day bringing new symptoms and deeper weakness that no amount of rest or medical attention seemed able to arrest. The irony was not lost on the former conqueror. His body, which had carried him to the heights of power and glory, was now becoming his final and most implacable enemy. Napoleon's health crisis began subtly in late 1817, but by 1818, the symptoms had become impossible to ignore. The former emperor found himself complaining of severe abdominal pain, constant nausea, and extreme fatigue that left him prostrated for days. Initially, he and his personal doctors attributed these symptoms to the tropical climate and the island's inadequate diet. But as the months passed, the symptoms intensified alarmingly. Napoleon began losing weight drastically, his once robust frame shrinking visibly with each passing week. His face became pale and hollow, the commanding features that had once inspired armies now gaunt and drawn. He developed vomiting episodes that lasted for hours, leaving him weak and trembling. His famous bursts of energy, those legendary moments when he would pace for hours dictating memoirs or planning hypothetical campaigns, gave way to prolonged periods of lethargy and depression. The man who once marched kilometers inspecting his troops, who could ride for days without rest during military campaigns, now could barely walk to the garden without leaning heavily on a cane. His attendants watched in dismay as their emperor struggled with tasks that would have been trivial just months before. Even the simple act of dressing became an ordeal that required assistance. The psychological impact of this physical decline was perhaps even more devastating than the symptoms themselves. Napoleon had always prided himself on his physical resilience and mental acuity. Now, faced with his body's betrayal, he began to withdraw from even his closest companions. Dr. Francesco Antimarchi, the Corsican physician sent by the Bonaparte family to care for Napoleon, arrived on the island in the year 1819. His arrival brought both hope and a sobering medical reality to Longwood House. Antimarchi was a skilled anatomist and physician, trained in the latest medical techniques of early 19th century Europe. His initial examination of Napoleon revealed the full extent of the emperor's deterioration. His diagnosis was pessimistic and deeply concerning. The former emperor was suffering from what appeared to be a severe form of hepatic dysfunction, possibly caused by the combination of tropical climate, extreme psychological stress, and a diet poor in fresh nutrients. The doctor noted Napoleon's enlarged liver, his jaundiced complexion, and the persistent abdominal swelling that had become increasingly pronounced. Antomarchi tried various treatments of the era, including bloodletting, purgatives, and a strict dietary regimen designed to reduce the strain on Napoleon's digestive system. He prescribed regular doses of calomel, a mercury-based compound commonly used for liver ailments, and attempted to regulate Napoleon's fluid intake. But nothing seemed to alleviate his patient's growing suffering. The treatments, harsh by modern standards, often left Napoleon weaker than before. The bloodletting sessions, intended to balance his humors according to medical theory of the time, only increased his pallor and weakness. The purgatives caused additional digestive distress, creating a cycle of treatment and suffering that seemed to accelerate rather than halt his decline. Napoleon had become a shadow of his former self, both literally and figuratively. The once robust emperor, who had commanded respect through sheer physical presence as much as intellectual brilliance, was now a frail figure confined increasingly to his bed. His weight loss was so dramatic that his clothes hung loosely on his diminished frame. The man who had once consumed enormous meals with legendary appetite now struggled to keep down even the simplest foods. His famous memory, once capable of recalling the names and faces of thousands of soldiers, began to show signs of deterioration. He would sometimes forget conversations from the previous day or become confused about dates and events. The psychological transformation was equally striking. The confident leader who had reshaped the map of Europe became increasingly melancholic and prone to dark moods. He spent hours staring out at the Atlantic Ocean, perhaps contemplating the vast distance between himself and the France he had once ruled. His dictated memoirs, initially a source of energy and purpose, became sporadic as his strength waned. The servants at Longwood House reported that he would sometimes call out in his sleep, reliving battles or giving orders to long-absent marshals. These episodes revealed the depth of his psychological struggle with his reduced circumstances. The man who had once controlled the fate of millions now couldn't control his own failing body. His attendants noted that he became increasingly sensitive to cold, requiring multiple blankets even in the tropical climate of Saint Helena. His hands, once steady enough to sign treaties that altered the course of history, now trembled when he attempted to write. The irony of his situation was not lost on Napoleon himself. In his lucid moments, he would reflect bitterly on the contrast between his current state and his former glory. He had survived countless battles, political upheavals, and the rigors of military campaigns that would have broken lesser men. Yet now, isolated on a remote island, his own body had become his most formidable and ultimately unconquerable enemy. The emperor who had once declared that impossible was not French was learning that mortality, unlike political opposition, could not be defeated through will and strategic brilliance alone. The transformation of Napoleon Bonaparte during his last years on Saint Helena represents one of history's most tragic spectacles of human decline. The man who had once commanded armies across Europe now struggled with the most basic physical functions, his body betraying him in ways that no enemy ever could. By 1820, Napoleon's physical deterioration had become impossible to ignore or minimize. His once imposing frame, which had carried him through countless battlefields and diplomatic negotiations, had become bloated and weak, a cruel parody of his former self. The emperor who had been known for his boundless energy and ability to work 18-hour days now found himself exhausted by the simple act of walking from his bedroom to his study. His face, once animated by the fierce intelligence that had captivated and terrified Europe's elite, had taken on a waxy, pallid appearance that spoke of internal suffering beyond mere physical discomfort. The penetrating gaze that had once made seasoned generals shift uncomfortably in their seats had dimmed to a distant, often unfocused stare that seemed to look through rather than at the people around him. Perhaps even more disturbing than his physical decline was the gradual deterioration of Napoleon's legendary mental acuity. The strategic genius who had revolutionized military tactics and reshaped the political landscape of Europe now found his thoughts drifting unpredictably between moments of startling clarity and periods of confused rambling. During his lucid intervals, Napoleon could still deliver brilliant analyses of European politics, dissect military campaigns with surgical precision, and engage in sophisticated discussions about literature, science, and philosophy. These moments of intellectual brilliance made his decline all the more heartbreaking for those who witnessed it, as they served as painful reminders of what he had once been. However, these periods of clarity became increasingly rare and brief as his condition worsened. More frequently, his companions would find him lost in melancholic reveries, his mind wandering through the corridors of memory, reliving past glories and defeats with equal intensity. He would speak to absent generals, issue orders to armies that no longer existed, and engage in animated conversations with figures from his past, who lived now only in his deteriorating mind. The memoir sessions with Count Las Cases and his other faithful companions became Napoleon's primary anchor to reality and purpose during these dark final years. These dictation sessions, which often lasted for hours, served multiple functions beyond the obvious goal of recording his version of historical events. They provided structure to his increasingly chaotic days, gave him a sense of purpose and agency in a situation where he had been stripped of all real power, and offered him the opportunity to shape how posterity would remember his extraordinary life and career. During these sessions, Napoleon revealed the full complexity of his psychological state, alternating between grandiose self-justification and moments of surprising self-awareness and regret. He would defend his most controversial decisions with passionate eloquence, arguing that his actions had been necessary for France's greatness and Europe's advancement. Yet in quieter moments, he would acknowledge the enormous human cost of his ambitions, admitting that millions had died in pursuit of his vision of a unified Europe under French leadership. The deteriorating relationship between Napoleon and Governor Hudson Lowe became a central source of torment during the emperor's final years, transforming what might have been a dignified exile into a daily battle of wills that served no one's interests. Lowe, initially cautious but professionally respectful toward his famous prisoner, gradually developed a deep personal animosity that went far beyond his official duties as the island's administrator. The governor's growing hostility stemmed from multiple sources of frustration that compounded over time. He resented being assigned to what he viewed as a career-ending post, responsible for guarding a man whose very presence on the island made normal governance impossible. Lowe also struggled with the impossible nature of his mission, caught between London's demands for absolute security and the practical challenges of maintaining some semblance of diplomatic courtesy toward a former head of state. The governor's personality, characterized by rigid adherence to regulations and a lack of imagination or flexibility, proved particularly ill-suited for managing such an unprecedented situation. Napoleon, for his part, seemed to take perverse pleasure in making Lowe's life as difficult as possible, perhaps viewing their daily conflicts as his last remaining battlefield. He would deliberately violate minor regulations, refuse to acknowledge Lowe's authority, and engage in elaborate schemes to embarrass the governor in front of visitors or subordinates. These petty battles over protocol and procedure became increasingly bitter and personal, with both men losing sight of any larger purpose beyond scoring points against their opponent. The psychological warfare between Napoleon and Lowe created an atmosphere of constant tension at Longwood House that affected everyone in the emperor's household. His loyal companions found themselves caught between their devotion to Napoleon and their desire to avoid unnecessary confrontations that only made their already difficult situation worse. The servants and guards, meanwhile, witnessed daily scenes of mutual antagonism that made their work environment increasingly unpleasant and stressful. As 1820 progressed into 1821, Napoleon's condition deteriorated with alarming rapidity, leaving his companions shocked by the speed of his decline. The mysterious illness that had been slowly sapping his strength for years now seemed to accelerate, as if his body had finally surrendered to the accumulated stresses of exile, humiliation, and despair. His appetite, never robust during his years on Saint Helena, virtually disappeared, leaving him gaunt and weak, despite his continued bloating from what appeared to be fluid retention. The severe abdominal pain that had plagued him intermittently now became a constant companion, often leaving him doubled over in agony and unable to concentrate on even simple tasks. Sleep, once a refuge from his daily torments, became elusive and fitful, filled with disturbing dreams that blended memories of past battles with nightmarish visions of his current predicament. His famous ability to dictate complex documents while pacing around his study gave way to long periods spent lying motionless in bed, staring at the ceiling with an expression of profound sadness that broke the hearts of those who cared for him. The emperor's mental state during these final months revealed the full tragedy of his situation, as moments of startling clarity alternated with periods of confusion and delirium that left his companions uncertain how to respond. During his lucid intervals, Napoleon displayed an acute awareness of his approaching death that was both dignified and heartbreaking. He would speak calmly about his funeral arrangements, express concern for his followers' welfare after his death, and even show flashes of his old humor and charm. However, these moments of clarity were increasingly interrupted by episodes of delirium during which he would relive past military campaigns, issue orders to long-dead marshals, and engage in animated conversations with invisible companions. These delirious episodes were particularly disturbing because they revealed the extent to which his mind remained focused on his past glories, unable to accept or integrate the reality of his present circumstances. The man who had once prided himself on his ability to face reality squarely and adapt to changing circumstances now seemed trapped in a mental prison constructed from memories of his former greatness. His physical suffering was matched by an emotional anguish that manifested itself in frequent expressions of regret and self-recrimination that surprised those who had known him as a man of supreme confidence and self-assurance. The emperor, who had rarely admitted mistakes or shown vulnerability, now spoke openly about his errors in judgment, the lives lost because of his decisions, and his deep sadness about the family members he would never see again. These moments of emotional honesty provided glimpses of a more human Napoleon, stripped of the imperial pretensions and strategic calculations that had defined his public persona for so many years. The relationship between Napoleon and Governor Hudson Lowe had deteriorated into something far beyond mere antagonism by 1820. What had begun as professional tension between captor and captive had evolved into a deeply personal vendetta that poisoned the atmosphere of the entire island. Lowe found himself trapped in an impossible position, serving as jailer to the most famous man in the world, while being relegated to what he considered a career, ending assignment on a remote volcanic rock in the South Atlantic. The governor had sacrificed his prospects for advancement in London, watching from afar as his contemporaries received prestigious postings and promotions while he remained bound to his thankless duty of guarding a fallen emperor. His resentment manifested in increasingly petty restrictions and bureaucratic harassment that seemed designed more to humiliate than to ensure security. Napoleon, for his part, developed what could only be described as a visceral hatred for the man he saw as the embodiment of British vindictiveness. In his carefully censored letters, the former emperor referred to Lowe as a butcher and executioner, accusations that carried particular weight coming from a man who had commanded armies across Europe and understood the true meaning of those terms. He accused the governor of attempting to kill him slowly through a campaign of constant humiliations and deliberately inadequate living conditions, a charge that may have contained more truth than the British government cared to admit. The psychological warfare between these two men created an atmosphere of toxic tension that permeated every aspect of daily life at Longwood House. Every interaction became a battle of wills, every administrative decision a potential source of conflict, every visitor's request an opportunity for one man to frustrate the other. This constant state of hostility certainly contributed to Napoleon's deteriorating health, as the stress of perpetual conflict wore down his already weakened constitution. The year 1820 marked a dramatic turning point in Napoleon's physical and mental decline. His condition worsened so significantly that even his most loyal companions began to fear for his life, though none dared speak openly of their concerns. The mysterious illness that had plagued him for years now began to manifest in increasingly alarming ways, with symptoms that defied the limited medical knowledge of the early 19th century. Most disturbing were the episodes of delirium that began to occur with frightening regularity. During these episodes, Napoleon would suddenly spring to life with an energy that seemed impossible given his weakened state, his eyes blazing with the old imperial fire as he relived the great battles of his career. He would pace the confines of his room like a caged lion, barking orders to imaginary generals, repositioning phantom troops, and fighting campaigns that existed only in his fevered mind. Observers described these scenes as both magnificent and heartbreaking, watching the greatest military mind of the age commanding armies that no longer existed in battles that had long since ended. He would call out to Marshal Ney, demanding reports on cavalry positions or shout instructions to General Murat about flanking maneuvers, his voice carrying the same authority that had once commanded the Grande Armée across the battlefields of Europe. These delirious episodes revealed the extent to which military command had defined Napoleon's very identity. Stripped of his empire, his armies, and his power, his mind retreated to the moments when he had been most truly himself, reliving the glory days when his strategic genius had reshaped the map of Europe. The periods of lucidity that followed these episodes became increasingly rare and brief, precious moments when the real Napoleon emerged from the fog of illness and delirium. During these clear intervals, he displayed a vulnerability and emotional honesty that would have been unthinkable during his years of power. He spoke with deep sadness about his family's fate, expressing particular anguish about his son, the King of Rome, whom he had not seen since his abdication in 1814. The boy, now living under Austrian protection and bearing the title Duke of Reichstadt, had become a symbol of everything Napoleon had lost. His voice would break when speaking of the child, who would grow up knowing his father only through history books and enemy propaganda, never experiencing the love and guidance that Napoleon desperately wanted to provide. These moments of paternal grief revealed a side of the emperor that few had ever witnessed, the private man who existed behind the public mask of imperial authority. Napoleon's final months were characterized by intense physical suffering that made his emotional torment seem almost secondary by comparison. The abdominal pain that had troubled him for years became so severe that he would spend entire days doubled over in agony, his body racked with spasms that left him gasping for breath. The man who had once marched across frozen battlefields and slept on the ground beside his soldiers now found himself unable to tolerate even the softest bed or the lightest meal. His appetite disappeared almost entirely, and the simple act of consuming enough food and water to sustain life became a monumental struggle. His body, which had once been his most reliable ally in the pursuit of power, now became his greatest enemy, betraying him at every turn and reducing him to complete dependence on his faithful companions. The transformation was particularly cruel for a man who had prided himself on physical endurance and had shared the hardships of campaign life with his troops. Now he required assistance with the most basic human needs, a humiliation that may have been more painful than any military defeat he had ever suffered. In March 1821, sensing that his time was growing short, Napoleon began the process of dictating his final will and testament. This document would prove to be a fascinating window into the mind of a dying emperor, revealing the complex mixture of grandiosity, bitterness, and unexpected tenderness that characterized his final thoughts. The will demonstrated that even in his weakened state, Napoleon remained acutely aware of his place in history and determined to shape his legacy through his final words and wishes. The morning light filtered through the windows of Longwood House on May 5, 1821, illuminating the still form of Napoleon Bonaparte. The man who had once commanded armies across continents now lay silent, his final breath having escaped in whispered fragments about France, his army, and his beloved Josephine. But death, it would seem, was not the end of Napoleon's story. Instead, it marked the beginning of one of history's most enduring medical mysteries. Within hours of Napoleon's death, the British authorities moved swiftly to establish the official narrative. Dr. Francis Burton, the senior British physician on Saint Helena, along with several other doctors, conducted a thorough autopsy of the former emperor's body. Their examination revealed what they concluded to be extensive stomach cancer, a malignant growth that had spread throughout Napoleon's abdomen. The doctors noted the diseased state of his stomach lining, the presence of what appeared to be cancerous lesions, and the general deterioration of his digestive system. This diagnosis seemed to align perfectly with the family medical history, as Napoleon's father, Charles Bonaparte, had died of a similar gastric condition at the age of 39. The British medical team documented their findings meticulously, creating detailed reports that would be sent back to London and eventually shared with European governments. For the British authorities, this medical conclusion served multiple purposes beyond simple scientific accuracy. A death by natural causes eliminated any potential diplomatic complications that might arise from accusations of mistreatment or deliberate harm. It also provided closure to what had become an increasingly expensive and politically sensitive situation for the British government. However, even as the ink dried on the official autopsy reports, Napoleon's French companions on the island began expressing their doubts about the medical conclusions. Count Bertrand, General Montholon, and the others who had witnessed Napoleon's decline firsthand found it difficult to accept that stomach cancer alone could explain the specific pattern of symptoms they had observed. They had watched their emperor suffer from episodes that seemed inconsistent with a simple gastric malignancy. The alternating periods of acute abdominal pain, the strange metallic taste Napoleon frequently complained about, the unusual hair loss, and the peculiar skin discoloration all suggested something more complex than cancer. Dr. Francesco Antimarchi, the Corsican physician sent by Napoleon's family, had arrived too late to provide effective treatment, but had observed enough to question the British medical assessment. Antimarchi noted discrepancies between what he observed and what the British doctors reported, though his own medical opinions carried less weight given his late arrival and limited examination time. The French companions' suspicions were further fueled by their awareness of the broader political context surrounding Napoleon's imprisonment. They understood that their emperor's continued existence posed a constant threat to the restored Bourbon monarchy in France and the delicate balance of power established by the Congress of Vienna. The possibility that someone might have deliberately hastened Napoleon's death was not beyond the realm of political calculation in early 19th century Europe. For nearly a century and a half, Napoleon's death remained officially attributed to stomach cancer, despite persistent rumors and alternative theories circulating among historians and Napoleon enthusiasts. However, in the 1960s, a dramatic development reignited the controversy surrounding the emperor's demise. Swedish toxicologist Sten Forshavud, working with samples of Napoleon's hair that had been preserved as relics, conducted sophisticated chemical analysis using modern forensic techniques unavailable in 1821. The results were startling and would fundamentally challenge the accepted historical narrative. Forshavud's analysis revealed arsenic levels in Napoleon's hair that were significantly higher than normal, suggesting chronic arsenic poisoning over an extended period. The pattern of arsenic concentration varied throughout different sections of hair, indicating that the exposure had been intermittent rather than constant. This discovery aligned remarkably well with the timeline of Napoleon's illness and the specific symptoms his companions had described. Arsenic poisoning, Forshavud argued, could explain the metallic taste, the alternating periods of illness and apparent recovery, the hair loss, the skin discoloration, and many other symptoms that had puzzled observers at the time. The toxicologist's findings were published in scientific journals and popular books, sparking intense debate among historians, medical experts, and Napoleon scholars worldwide. Subsequent hair analysis by other laboratories confirmed the presence of elevated arsenic levels, though interpretations of what this meant varied considerably. Some researchers supported Forshavud's poisoning theory, arguing that the arsenic levels were too high to be explained by environmental exposure alone. Others contended that arsenic was commonly present in many 19th century household items, including wallpaper, medications, and even cosmetics, making it possible that Napoleon's exposure was accidental rather than deliberate. The debate intensified when researchers discovered that the wallpaper at Longwood House contained arsenic-based green pigments, which could potentially release toxic vapors under certain humidity conditions. This environmental explanation offered a middle ground between deliberate poisoning and natural death, suggesting that Napoleon might have been slowly poisoned by his living environment rather than by human malice. However, proponents of the deliberate poisoning theory pointed out that environmental arsenic exposure typically produces different patterns of accumulation than what was found in Napoleon's hair samples. They also noted that not everyone living at Longwood House suffered from similar symptoms, despite sharing the same potentially toxic environment. Today, more than 2 centuries after Napoleon's death, the medical mystery remains unresolved, with compelling arguments on multiple sides of the debate. Modern forensic pathologists acknowledge that both stomach cancer and arsenic poisoning could potentially explain many of Napoleon's symptoms, and it is even possible that both conditions were present simultaneously. Some contemporary medical experts have suggested that Napoleon might have suffered from a gastric ulcer caused by Helicobacter pylori bacteria, a condition that was unknown to 19th century medicine, but is now recognized as a common cause of stomach problems. This bacterial infection could have produced symptoms similar to both cancer and poisoning, adding another layer of complexity to the diagnostic puzzle. The arsenic controversy has also been complicated by questions about the authenticity and provenance of the hair samples used in various studies. Hair collection was a common practice among Napoleon's admirers and companions, but the chain of custody for many samples is unclear, raising questions about potential contamination or mislabeling over the decades. Advanced DNA analysis techniques now available could potentially resolve some of these authentication issues, but access to verified samples remains limited. The political implications of the poisoning theory continue to fascinate historians and conspiracy theorists alike. If Napoleon was indeed murdered, the list of potential suspects would include not only British officials concerned about the cost and security risks of his imprisonment, but also French royalists, other European powers, or even members of his own entourage who might have had personal or political motives. Count Montholon, one of Napoleon's most trusted companions, has been suggested as a possible poisoner by some theorists, though the evidence for this accusation remains circumstantial and highly controversial. Regardless of the ultimate cause of death, Napoleon's final months on Saint Helena represent a profound human tragedy that transcends the medical mystery. The man who had reshaped European civilization found himself reduced to arguing about library arrangements and garden boundaries, his magnificent mind increasingly clouded by illness and isolation. His death marked not just the end of an individual life, but the conclusion of an extraordinary historical epoch that had begun with the French Revolution and culminated in the Napoleonic Wars. The mystery surrounding his death has, in many ways, become part of his enduring legend, ensuring that even in death, Napoleon Bonaparte remains a figure of controversy, fascination, and endless speculation. Whether he died from natural causes, environmental poisoning, or deliberate murder may never be definitively resolved, but the questions surrounding his death continue to illuminate the complex political, medical, and human dimensions of one of history's most remarkable lives. The mystery surrounding Napoleon's death would prove to be only the beginning of a legend that refused to die with the man himself. Many of his most devoted followers, including the faithful Count Las Cases, who had shared his exile and recorded his memoirs, never accepted the official British explanation of stomach cancer. They maintained with unwavering conviction that their emperor had been slowly poisoned by the British authorities as a calculated method to eliminate him without creating an obvious martyr who might inspire future uprisings across Europe. This poisoning theory, dismissed by British officials as the desperate fantasies of bitter loyalists, would gain unexpected credibility more than a century later when 20th century scientific analyses of Napoleon's preserved hair samples revealed dramatically elevated levels of arsenic. The discovery sent shockwaves through the historical community and reignited passionate debates about the true cause of Napoleon's death. Some historians and forensic experts argued that small but constant doses of arsenic, administered over months or years, could indeed have caused the precise constellation of symptoms that Napoleon exhibited during his final years on Saint Helena. The chronic stomach pain, the gradual weakening, the periods of delirium alternating with moments of clarity, and even the peculiar preservation of his body after death all aligned with known patterns of chronic arsenic poisoning. However, alternative explanations emerged to challenge the murder theory, including the possibility of accidental contamination from arsenic-containing paints that were commonly used in wallpapers and decorative elements throughout European homes of that era. The damp, poorly ventilated rooms of Longwood House with their peeling wallpapers and deteriorating conditions, could have slowly released arsenic compounds into the air that Napoleon breathed daily for 6 long years. Even more intriguingly, some of the medications prescribed by his own doctors contained arsenic compounds, which were considered standard treatments for various ailments in early 19th century medicine. Following his death on that fateful morning of May 5, 1821, Napoleon's body was initially buried in a deliberately isolated valley on Saint Helena, beneath a weeping willow tree that he had often admired during his melancholy walks around the island. The British government, still fearful of Napoleon's power to inspire even in death, refused to allow any inscription or marker to identify the grave, calculating that an anonymous burial site would prevent it from becoming a pilgrimage destination for Bonapartists across Europe. For 19 long years, from 1821 to 1840, the tomb remained deliberately anonymous and largely forgotten, visited only occasionally by colonial officials who needed to verify that the most dangerous man in Europe was indeed still safely buried in his island prison. The weeping willow grew larger over the unmarked grave, its drooping branches creating a natural canopy that seemed to mourn the fallen emperor in perpetual silence. But the wheel of history continued to turn, and political circumstances in France began to shift in ways that would transform Napoleon from a buried exile into a national symbol of French glory. In 1840, King Louis, Philip of France, seeking to strengthen his own legitimacy and appeal to French nationalism, initiated secret diplomatic negotiations with the British government for the return of Napoleon's remains to French soil. The operation, known as the Retour des Cendres, or Return of the Ashes, became a French national event of absolutely epic proportions that captured the imagination of an entire generation. When the French frigate Belle Poule arrived at Saint Helena to retrieve the emperor's body, the exhumation revealed that Napoleon's corpse had been remarkably well preserved, lending further credence to theories about arsenic poisoning, which is known to act as a preservative. The journey back to France became a triumphant procession that reversed the humiliation of 1815, transforming Napoleon from a defeated exile into a martyred hero returning home. Massive crowds lined the streets of Paris on December 15, 1840, to witness the funeral procession that carried Napoleon's remains from the Seine River to their final resting place at Les Invalides. The ceremony was deliberately orchestrated as a spectacle of national reconciliation and imperial nostalgia, with veterans of Napoleon's campaigns weeping openly as they saluted their emperor one final time. The government estimated that over 1 million people participated in or witnessed the funeral procession, making it one of the largest public gatherings in French history to that point. Napoleon's tomb at Les Invalides became exactly what the British had feared: a shrine that attracts millions of visitors from around the world who come to pay homage to the man who had once held Europe in his grasp. The magnificent red porphyry sarcophagus, surrounded by elaborate sculptures and imperial symbols, stands as a testament to how death can sometimes enhance rather than diminish a legend. The transformation from the anonymous grave under a weeping willow to the Grand-Andes tomb in Paris represents one of history's most dramatic reversals of fortune, proving that even the most carefully laid plans to erase a man's legacy can ultimately fail when that man's story captures the eternal human fascination with power, ambition, and the tragic fall of the mighty. The ship that carried Napoleon's remains from Saint Helena to France in 1840 was no ordinary vessel. The Belle Poule, a French frigate specially commissioned for this sacred mission, transformed what had been a journey of exile into a voyage of redemption. Prince de Joinville, son of King Louis, Philip, personally oversaw the exhumation and return of the emperor's body, turning the retrieval into a ceremony of national reconciliation. When the coffin was opened on Saint Helena after 19 years in the ground, witnesses were astonished to find Napoleon's body remarkably well preserved, as if death had only recently claimed him. This extraordinary preservation became another layer of mystery surrounding the man who had defied conventional understanding throughout his life. The journey to Les Invalides, Napoleon's final resting place in Paris, represented the ultimate vindication of his belief that history would judge him kindly. The magnificent tomb beneath the golden dome of Les Invalides stands as perhaps the most visited grave in the world, drawing millions who come to pay homage to the man who reshaped Europe. More than 2 centuries after Napoleon's death, Modern science continues to grapple with the question of what actually killed him. Advanced forensic techniques unavailable to 19th century physicians have opened new avenues of investigation while simultaneously creating new controversies. Hair samples preserved by his loyal followers have been subjected to neutron activation analysis, revealing elevated levels of arsenic that far exceed normal concentrations. These findings have reignited the poisoning theory, though critics argue that arsenic was commonly found in medicines, wallpapers, and even cosmetics of the era. The debate has expanded beyond simple arsenic poisoning to include theories about chronic exposure to environmental toxins on Saint Helena itself. Some researchers have proposed that the damp, moldy conditions at Longwood House, combined with the island's volcanic soil, created a perfect storm of environmental hazards. Others have suggested that Napoleon's own habits, including his preference for sweet wines and his use of various medications, contributed to his mysterious illness. The stomach cancer diagnosis made by British physicians in 1821 remains plausible, supported by Napoleon's family history and the documented progression of his symptoms. Yet the rapid deterioration in his final months, combined with the specific nature of his suffering, continues to puzzle medical historians. Modern gastroenterologists who have studied the autopsy reports note inconsistencies that were not apparent to physicians of Napoleon's time. The controversy extends beyond medical questions to encompass broader issues of historical truth and the reliability of official accounts from politically motivated sources. Napoleon's final years on Saint Helena witnessed a profound transformation that went far beyond his physical deterioration. The man who had once commanded armies across Europe found himself reduced to petty disputes over household management and garden privileges. This psychological metamorphosis reveals perhaps the cruelest aspect of his imprisonment, the systematic stripping away of everything that had defined his identity as emperor and military genius. His obsessive attention to trivial domestic matters served as a coping mechanism for a mind accustomed to grand strategy and continental politics. The dictation of his memoirs became both a lifeline to his former greatness and a form of psychological torture, forcing him to relive his triumphs while confronting his ultimate defeat. His companions noted how he would alternate between periods of sharp intellectual clarity and episodes of profound melancholy that left him staring silently at the walls of Longwood House. The physical changes were equally dramatic, as the compact, energetic figure who had once reviewed troops for hours on horseback became a bloated, pain-ridden invalid who could barely walk around his garden. Yet even in decline, flashes of his former brilliance would emerge, particularly when discussing military strategy or European politics with his remaining followers. These moments of clarity made his deterioration all the more poignant, highlighting the tragedy of a great mind trapped in a failing body on a remote island prison. Napoleon's death at Saint Helena serves as one of history's most powerful reminders of the ultimate equality imposed by mortality. The man who had crowned himself Emperor of the French, and whose name had struck fear into the hearts of European monarchs, died alone, attended only by a handful of faithful servants. His final words, reportedly France, army, Josephine, encapsulated the three great passions of his life and revealed what mattered most to him in his final moments of consciousness. The irony of his fate extends beyond his personal tragedy to encompass broader themes about the nature of power and the wheel of fortune that governs human affairs. His transformation from the master of Europe to a prisoner dependent on British charity illustrates how quickly and completely fortunes can reverse. The medical mystery surrounding his death has become a metaphor for the enigmatic nature of the man himself, someone who continues to defy easy categorization or simple explanation. Modern research techniques may eventually solve the riddle of what killed Napoleon, but the deeper mysteries of his character and legacy remain as compelling as ever. His story continues to fascinate because it embodies the eternal human themes of ambition, power, love, betrayal, and ultimate mortality that resonate across cultures and centuries. The terrible end of Napoleon Bonaparte at Saint Helena closed not merely an extraordinary individual life, but an entire epoch of European history. His complex legacy of glory and tragedy, of revolutionary ideals and imperial ambition, ensures that his story will continue to captivate future generations seeking to understand the heights and depths of human achievement and failure.